It's finally here, the day you've all been waiting for. I know you've been chomping at the bit for this budget 2025. As well as talking about the budget, we are going to be talking actually about potentially something more significant. I think if there was a policy that's going to go down in the history books this week, it's not anything in the budget. It is the plans to get rid of juries for nearly all trials, which is a sort of change from sort of 8 centuries of British precedent, much more fundamental than anything that was in the budget. And we'll also talk about the Palestine Action case, which is being heard by the High Court. It's not a juryless trial, it's a judge-led hearing, I suppose. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. The lead up to the 2025 budget has been long and tortuous. There have been weeks and months of leaks and U-turns, which made the cock-up late this morning even harder to swallow for Rachel Reeves. That was because at around 11:30, an hour before the Chancellor was due to stand up and deliver her long-awaited budget, which she'd spent oh so long writing, the OBR published it by accident. Now, they just put it out on their website an hour ahead, her budget. Very annoying for her. Kemi Badenoch, though, pounced at PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, this has been the most chaotic lead-up to a budget in living memory. With resignations, hostile briefings and leaks galore, even just in the last 10 minutes, an unprecedented leak of the OBR analysis. Unbelievable. Mr. Speaker, these leaks have been so serious that even the former chief economist of the Bank of England has said, and I quote, that Labour's fiscal fandango is the single biggest reason why growth has flatlined. Does the Prime Minister agree with Andy Haldane, and does he have an explanation for this complete shambles?
We all know the biggest shambles in living history, the Liz Truss budget. And what did she say at the time? Did she say, I don't agree, this must be wrong? No, she said, I think Liz Truss is 100% right. 100%. Not much room for flexibility. Not one thing was wrong with it, in her view. So we won't be taking lectures from her. Matters for the OBR. The Chancellor will set out the budget in just a few minutes' time.
I was going to say Keir Starmer's been dining out on that for a while, but actually the Tories dined out on the whole there's no money left letter for 14 years, so maybe you can give them a break. The OBR apologised for accidentally publishing their analysis of the budget ahead of time, and it did leave Rachel Reeves with the unenviable task of delivering an hour-long speech, the contents of which everyone already knew.
I said there would be no return to austerity, and I meant it. This budget will maintain investment in our economy and in our National Health Service. I said I would cut the cost of living, and I meant it. This budget will bring down inflation and provide immediate relief for families. I said I would cut debt and borrowing, and I meant it. Because of this budget, borrowing will fall as a share of GDP in every year of this forecast. Our net financial debt will be lower at the end of the forecast than it is today, and I will more than double the headroom against our stability rule to £21.7 billion, meeting our stability rule and meeting it a year early. These are my choices, not austerity, not borrowing, not turning a blind eye to unfairness. My choices are a budget for fair taxes, strong public services and a stable economy. That is the Labour choice.
Rachel Reeves earlier this week said the budget would be a Labour budget and that Labour MPs would like 95% of it. I mean, the main progressive part of the speech had already been briefed in the papers over the weekend. So that was the ending of the 2-child benefit cap. That will bring lots of children out of poverty. Of course, Rachel Reeves also wanted to increase her so-called fiscal headroom, meaning that she would also need to raise taxes. And there were big tax hikes. So the main one, income tax thresholds, will be frozen until 2030, 2 years longer than had previously been expected, meaning more of our total incomes will be subject to income tax and more people will be brought into the top rate of tax. There were also changes to the way national insurance is charged on money put into pension schemes. Fairly technical, that one. And a new annual tax on houses worth over £2 million. So that's one that's been called the mansion tax. In total, tax increases announced by Rachel Reeves amounted to £26 billion, which means that taxes are the highest they've ever been as a proportion of GDP. This is a chart from that OBR report that was released too early. You can see taxes are projected to rise to 38% of GDP by 2029. That's 1% higher than was projected in the OBR's March forecast. Spending by then is supposed to be just over 44% of GDP. Again, that's by 2029, 2030. So about 1% higher than was projected by the OBR in March. So sort of spending projections have gone up a bit, tax projections have gone up a bit. That leaves us slightly more headroom, according to Rachel Reeves and the OBR. What's interesting is, as the basic maths would suggest, we will still be spending a lot more money than we're raising in tax by 2030. But as I said, Britain's so-called fiscal headroom will still be higher than was the case in March. So in this budget, Reeves has now created £22 billion of headroom compared to her fiscal rules, which is up from £10 billion in March. James, I know I can hear you because I heard a little cough in the background there. I want your full judgment on the budget in due course. I want to start, though, with some basic sort of explanations. So the government is currently spending a lot more than it's taking in taxes. In 2030, the government will be spending a lot more than it's taking in taxes. Yet Rachel Reeves has increased her so-called fiscal headroom. So that might sound a bit confusing, first off. How are those things all consistent?
The issue with the fiscal rules is that, it's about getting a balance over time on one part of government spending, which is current spending. So it's the day-to-day spending. So how much does the government spend on salaries? How much does it spend on paying electricity to keep the lights on? How much does it spend on toilet rolls? These are kind of the day-to-day expenditures of government. So the fiscal rule says those will be brought into line over the next 3 years or so. And then once it's in line, it'll be balanced out for forever from that point onwards. So in other words, it doesn't have to match up immediately right now. And it's only part of what the government does. So it's the current spending. Capital spending, in other words, spending on building a new hospital or building a railway line or something big and long-lasting, doesn't have to balance in the same way. So that's how the whole thing can kind of rumble on in the way that Rachel Reeves has laid out here.
That said by 2030, spending will be 44% of GDP and taxes will be 38% of GDP. The 6% in the middle there is capital spending, or maybe spending on interest payments. I don't know. What is the 6% in the middle?
It's capital spending. It's a spending on interest payments, which are outside of the current budget rule. And it's a little bit, and it's the fact that you don't actually have to close the entire thing over time. So it's an ongoing rolling basis. This is actually underneath all of this is not a completely ridiculous idea, which is that the government is very big. It can't really go bankrupt. So whatever borrowing it has now is kind of a rolling basis. This is why you see sometimes that we've only just paid off the debt from like the Napoleonic Wars or the Second World War or some big distant thing in the past. It's true, and it's because you can, as a government, basically persuade people who are going to lend you money that you're still going to be around next year, in 10 years' time, in 30 years' time. So you can roll over this debt quite happily. The problem you have is getting the balance of how you make that happen, right? The big one is the economy growing, which usually means you're going to get more taxes in. What's interesting with this budget that we've just been presented is that the economy is actually not growing as much as was expected. I mean, that's one of the underlying things that's happening over the next few years. The OBR says growth has slowed down, but inflation's a bit higher, so that it's getting more money in taxes, so you can kind of pay off more of the debt and keep everything ticking along. And that's one of the things that enables the government to meet its own rules over this period of time. It's a peculiarity of living in a monetary economy. The government gets taxes in the form of money and pays out to its debtors in the form of money. So if there's more money sloshing around, even if that's a result of inflation, life can be a bit easier for the government. And that's what's happened here.
And inflation is especially helpful for them if they keep freezing the tax thresholds. And that's where most of their money is going to come from, or not, 8 billion of the 26. So they're going to raise 26 billion in what was announced today. 8 billion of that will come from freezes to income tax thresholds. What do you make of that?
Well, it's problematic because I would call it a stealth tax. It kind of used to be, because various governments over the last 20 odd years now really have gone like, inflation over time means that a lot of people are just getting paid a bit more. I mean, a lot of people have wages that are sort of linked to, not always very well, but roughly linked to what happens on inflation. You get a kind of inflation-linked pay rise. So gradually, as inflation has gone up, everybody's income has gone up. And for a few people, you've actually done better than that. So you've really sort of risen up a bit and your real earnings are better. But then you hit the tax thresholds, which kick in at whatever it was, about £19,000 off the top of my head for basic rate, and then £50,000 now for the higher rate. And then there's a distant additional rate that you can get to as well. If you freeze these and everybody's getting paid more, over time you'll kind of cross them and start paying more income tax on that part of your earnings, right? That's how the progressive tax system works. So over that level, you pay a bit more tax. If the government just holds those levels steady and everybody's earnings are moving past them, it will just earn a bit more money. And that's what we got here. It's about £8.6 billion, I think it's scored as, over the next year or so, that it's going to get from this sitting the thresholds for the different levels of income tax exactly where they are, so it captures more people as wages rise steadily with inflation over time.
Yeah, and I suppose where I'm going with it, is that problematic? So there's something a bit dishonest about it. It would be more honest to just say we're going to whack 1 or 2% on income tax, and instead saying, well, we're going to keep income tax the same, but more of you are going to pay different rates. There's something, it doesn't seem like a particularly sort of honest and open way of doing economics. But at the same time, you can see why she did it, right? And I mean, I've been reading a bunch of articles over the past couple of weeks suggesting that middle earners aren't very taxed in this country. So sort of like the idea that they'd pay a bit more tax isn't so bad. We should just be a bit more honest about it.
There's a look. I think you're right. There's a political problem that's starting to emerge, because I think people are becoming aware of this, which is your thresholds. If you want to kind of tax the same proportion of people, right? That's what you're supposed to have in a progressive tax system. You say, okay, 10% of people will pay this much, and gradually that 10% barrier will move up because everyone's getting paid more, because we live in an economy where inflation happens. So everyone's getting paid more to sort of march along with that. So yeah, there's a kind of dishonesty or a stealthiness about it that is built into taking this approach. And actually, it doesn't raise that much money in the scheme of things. There's £8 billion here, right? It's not nothing, right? It's the biggest single move the government has made out of the list of things that it's done. But it's not the same as just being really upfront and saying, hey, we've got a load of stuff we need to pay for. This is the big tax rise that we're going to have to do. Now, the government did make these manifesto promises that it wouldn't change the headline rates of income tax, national insurance contributions, and VAT. So to break its manifesto, it could say income tax rate, it goes up a bit. There was some talk about the government doing this a few weeks ago, but they backed right away from that, probably because of the political problem. So you end up with this kind of stealthy tax instead, where you freeze the thresholds and let inflation do its work, and you get more money in as a result of that. The bigger question is that, look, this is this kind of managing decline world that we're in here. It's a bit like, look, we'll kind of fudge the issue. We do need more tax, right? That's a thing that's definitely going to be the case. We need more tax in because we are going to have to pay for in the future the NHS, which is expensive with an aging population. We need to spend a lot of money patching up the economy for all the things we didn't do because of austerity for the last 10, 15 years. We're going to get more tax in. That's going to happen in some form. We're trying to do this stealthily rather than having quite an honest conversation about it and about where those taxes will land. This government has said, no wealth taxes, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do a whole stack of other smaller things that we could look at. But instead, we're going to kind of continue to just about get away with stealth taxes in the form of threshold freezes, a few other bits and pieces here and there, some of it quite good. I mean, increasing the tax on what you would pay on your investment income, on your property income, it's actually not a bad thing to be doing, but it doesn't add up to the kind of sums we need to be talking about to have a serious long-term reform of the tax system in this country.
Let's go to spending. The biggest progressive policy in this budget was the removal of the two-child benefit cap. Let's look at how that was announced.
And so because I am tackling fraud and error in our welfare system, because I am cracking down on tax avoidance, because I am reforming gambling taxation, I can announce today, fully costed and fully funded, the removal of the two-child limit in full from April. this side of the house. It's amazing what people get so angry about, and we've seen their true colours today. The thing they get angry about is lifting children out of poverty. We on this side of the house do not believe that the solution to a broken welfare system is to punish the most vulnerable. We are lifting 450,000 children out of poverty with the end of the two-child limit. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, combined with other actions we are taking, this Labour government is achieving the biggest reduction in child poverty over a parliament since records began. That is the difference that this Labour government is making.
So that was an announcement that has pleased child poverty campaigners. I mean, it will lift tens of thousands, I think hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. Very popular with Labour backbenchers. They've actually taken a bit of a risk here, though, haven't they, James? Because this is unpopular with the public. And it's actually unpopular with the public from all parties. I'm not sure if the Greens have been polled, but sort of Labour voters also think there should be a two-child cap. Reform voters really think there should be a two-child cap. So I suppose, should it be credit where it's due here, which is that Labour have done something quite brave in sort of going against public opinion to do something which we believe will lift kids out of poverty?
Well, I don't think it's that hard against public opinion if you start to look at what Labour voters in particular are saying, and also the people that Labour are now really worried about, which is people who might decide to switch from Labour to the Greens. I mean, this is where the political pressure has come from. The demand to remove the two-child benefit cap was, around about 12 months ago, there were Labour MPs losing the whip because they were demanding this and refusing to vote with the government in failing to do that. So it's a political sort of huge problem inside the Labour Party, which has now become something the government has had to deal with because they want to manage their internal problem, and also which is a sort of external problem of having a left alternative to Labour, which is in the form of the Greens in particular. So that's why they've done this. And let's be serious about this. 450,000 children out of poverty is a good, progressive, correct thing to be doing, and it should have been something the government did straight away. And it kind of doesn't matter if the polling says, a lot of people who vote Reform don't like it very much. I don't care. I think 450,000 children out of poverty is a good thing, and we should think that we've actually won something here because people campaigned and fought for it, and that's how to approach this one. The figures that the government was putting out was that 100 children a day were being pushed into poverty by the presence of the two-child cap since it was introduced way back in April 2017. This was nadir. This was the worst of the worst of the worst of austerity, and it's now been got rid of. Now, we shouldn't have had to fight for that, for this government, a Labour government, to do this. But the fact that it's happened is something to celebrate rather than sit there going, oh, well, maybe it doesn't poll too well. I don't care. It was the right thing to do. And I know the cynical reasons that have been calculated here about why this Labour government did it, which is their backbenchers were complaining, and there's a number of their MPs starting to think, I might lose my seat to the Greens, to the left, rather than to the right. That's why they did it, but we got there, and it's good that it's done.
Is there anything else sort of in this budget that was interesting? So I suppose, Labour are always saying they want to get growth. Is a budget sort of the moment to say you're going to build this and that, and you're going to invest in this many homes, and you're going to invest in some high-speed rail? I know, was there any, big, bold, futuristic, we're going to bring about a new Britain in this budget? Or should we even expect that to be in a budget?
I mean, you should expect that to be in a budget, and the time to have done it was last year, the first budget, or even sooner. Rachel Reeves should have done what Osborne did way back in 2010, which is just go, here's an emergency budget. I mean, you turn up and just go straight away, as soon as you're elected, this is the problem, we're going to fix it. Now, what we got with Rachel Reeves last year was, oh God, everything's bad. She did a big speech, it's all awful. And then we sat around for about 3 months before she did the budget, which did a few things. Raised national insurance contributions for employers with consequences that we're now having to grapple with, by the way, and increased public spending a fair bit. You didn't get that this year. The big story of this budget is that mostly, everything has gone into increasing the headroom. And what this headroom, to explain, is the gap between the amount of borrowing the government's own fiscal rules say the government could do, the absolute limit that it's set for itself, and the amount of borrowing that's done. So it's created this kind of wiggle room for itself, about £22 billion. The problem the government has had in the last 12 months is that it had very little wiggle room. So any kind of economic upsets of even quite a small variety, just a vague market panic, sentiment for a day looks a bit adverse, as they say. The people trading bonds were feeling a bit shaky about this government. immediately starts to turn into a bit of a political crisis. They want to stop that happening. So they put an immense effort into getting to a very, very large headroom, lots of wiggle room over the next 12 months. So they're hoping to not have the kind of instability that we've seen over this year. That's the really big story of this budget. That if you look at the figures, that's where most of the effort is going. The government is raising taxes in order to basically create a bit of wiggle room for itself, right? Now, the problem with that is that if you're raising taxes, you're taking money out of the economy and you're just kind of sitting on it because it's all going into headroom, you are drawing demand, drawing spending out of the economy. Because if I pay my tax, I'm not spending it in a shop, right? So there's no demand there when I pay my tax. It just goes to the government instead. And at a time where growth on the OBR forecast is already slowing down, when you know there's a lot of pressure on household budgets already, that you think, okay, this is a budget that is likely to drag further on growth over the next year. And that's the sort of horrible irony of a lot of this stuff, that Rachel Reeves is trying to create a lot of space for herself with the creating the headroom. She wants to, at some points, talk up growth and how that's going to rescue us all. But by creating this headroom, by really going for it, she's draining demand out of the economy and she's pushing hard against the growth that she also claims she wants.
The Greens under Zach Polanski are ahead of Labour in some opinion polls, and Labour are clearly very worried. Rachel Reeves name-checked Zach Polanski in her budget.
I know that the leader of the Green Party is a keen hypnotherapist, and he believes that he can achieve remarkable things using only the power of his mind. Unfortunately, the only things getting bigger under his approach would be the deficit and the rate of inflation.
So the joke there was a reference to Zach Polanski agreeing to use hypnosis to help a Sun journalist increase their breast size. That was a decade ago. Polanski's response to Reeves' jibe was, I think, quite strong. So he said a few things are getting bigger, Chancellor. Green Party membership, Green Party polling, and Labour's increased desperate attacks. And then he says, if you agree, we should be bringing down bills and taxing the super wealthy, join the greenparty.org. So he does this thing now when anyone's attacking him, he sort of quote tweets them and has the link for join the Green Party, which seems to be working because they got 175,000 members, which is pretty damn decent. Rachel Reeves, though, clearly does think she's found a weakness in Zach's platform, so not from his past, but from his present. And scrutiny over whether Polanski's plans would increase debt and inflation have increased since his interview with Laura Kuenssberg, where he suggested we shouldn't worry too much about debt or the bond markets. That interview prompted an article in Bloomberg this week saying the City of London was worried about the Greens' disregard for markets. They quoted a leading investment banker saying this. So he's a pound shop Andy Burnham is basically what we're concluding. There's this idea that it's the ideological attachment of people in the city or people in the mainstream who have this association. The reality is it's a function of having creditors to the tune of £2.7 trillion. That was a leading investment banker saying, we're not here trying to exert ideological pressure on the government. It's just if you're in debt to us, you're going to have to show us you can pay it back. Polanski responded to that article saying this. The city and elites are apparently worried about me. The people who bankrupted this country are spooked. Won't someone think of the billionaires again with that join.greenparty.org.uk? This strategy is really working for him. Polanski also did an interview with the New Statesman this week, though, where he was asked about his spending plans and fiscal rules. And this is from that piece. It's written by George Eaton. The charge that Polanski will face is that the Greens' tax plans would not fund their promise of a £160 billion rise in day-to-day spending. Would he adopt fiscal rules to reassure the markets? And then this is a quote from Polanski. The fiscal rule we need to have is to make sure that inflation doesn't go higher than the skills and resources that we have in our economy. And then George Eaton writes, it's an argument reminiscent of modern monetary theory, MMT, which argues that inflation is the only real restraint on countries such as the UK that can issue their own currency in brackets, and which mainstream economists often dismiss as voodoo economics. James, what's going on here? I suppose I'll put my cards on the table. I think Zach is on very strong ground when he's talking about the need for a wealth tax. Article in Reuters this week sort of saying the Norwegians, actually theirs has worked quite well. The public want one. I think the economics stacks up. Some of this stuff about spending, I think, are where the weaknesses are. I wanted to know what your perspective is.
Look, I think Zach's basically dealt with this well throughout. He's given some clear and direct and entirely truthful answers. I mean, look, if you're telling Laura Kuenssberg or anybody else that the Bank of England owns about 20% of UK government debt, £550 billion, I think it's a figure at the minute, this is entirely accurate. This is, in fact, what has happened as a result of doing quantitative easing for the last 15 or so years, since 2009. So yeah, it's a long old period of time. The Bank of England has been effectively lending money to government by buying its bonds. So that is true. The difficulty and the challenge is this may be true, but what do you do with that fact? I mean, look, I think Zach also did the right thing in talking about why is it that we are paying large amounts of money to the Bank of England as a result of quantitative easing, about £20 billion a year, which the Bank of England takes and then hands out as interest payments to various commercial banks that have a bank account with the Bank of England. This is a side effect of quantitative easing. And he's right to raise that. And he's not the only politician who's done that. I mean, Gordon Brown has talked about this being a problem. Richard Tice has talked about this being a problem. Paul Tucker, not a politician, but former deputy governor of the Bank of England, has talked about this. So I think when Zach brings into question the relationship between the Treasury and the Bank of England and says this is somewhat dysfunctional in a large part that is costing us money. I mean, £20 billion a year, which is what we're handing over to the Bank of England, is a lot of money. You won't necessarily get all of that, but you can get a great old chunk of it. I think he's right. Where he's going to have difficulty, and you can see the difficulties appearing in some of the responses to the Laura Kuenssberg interview, is that what can look like an abstract accountancy truth, the Bank of England owns 20% of UK government debt, true, does not mean that you can just go, the Bank of England can therefore cancel the entirety of that debt and monetize £550 billion, and this is a consequence-free environment. It is not. The polarization of some of the discussion around that between what I think is a deeply unhelpful argument from people influenced by modern monetary theory, which goes, hey, the debt doesn't really matter, government can just print money, on one side. Or on the other hand, actually, a bunch of people going like, the bond markets are all powerful, we must bow down before them, and everything we do is subservient to what the bond markets want. Both of these things are wrong, right? We're in a difficult situation. It's going to be dealing with the economy we have, getting it working is a bit like diffusing a bomb. You know, you're going to have to pick away at various bits carefully so the thing doesn't blow up in your face. Liz Truss just went chonk straight to all the wires and it blew up. So we don't want to do that. So there's a point in between that we have to get to. Ideas like the ones that Zach and Gordon Brown and Richard Tice, to give him credit, have talked about, which is paying less money to the Bank of England to run its monetary operations. I think this is a good thing to talk about. Going whoopee-doo, a load of debt is just owed to the Bank of England, which Zach didn't say. He didn't say the next step, which is, hey, let's just cancel it. But just going, oh, okay, that's all we need to think about. It's not real money. It's all fake. Off we go. That's not good either. But then again, neither is the Labour government's approach of going like, everything is subservient to the bond markets. That's all we have to worry about. We've got to pick our way through this. And that's not necessarily a clear and simple and immediate sort of conversation to have. But I think we have to get to the point of having a serious conversation about it, at least.
Is there a bit of a power struggle going on? Obviously, the Green Party is now where all the action is at. I mean, with all due respect to your party, maybe they'll pull it out of the hat this weekend. But at the moment, as it stands in the polls, the Green Party is where it's at. And it does seem like Zach sometimes sounds a bit like Gary Stevenson. So he's talking about the thing you definitely need to do is tax the rich, and that's all that really matters. Not that Gary would say that's all that really matters, but that's sort of the key thing. And then sometimes he is sounding more MMT. So I do think the fiscal rule we need to have is to make sure that inflation doesn't go higher than the skills and resources we have in our economy. That does sound, I mean, I can't make much sense of that, but it does sound like MMT. You were listed in Bloomberg as the unofficial advisor to Zach Polanski. Is there a sort of struggle going on between MMTers and people who believe in fiscal rules? Can you give us any update?
Look, what I've just described is the complexity of the situation. Here's what's happened. For the last 15 years or so, and all the way up into the pandemic and a bit beyond, you could do the Corbyn programme that we had from 2015 onwards, which was basically like, we can just borrow a load of money and it doesn't matter, really, because interest rates are the lowest in human history, right? For about a decade or more, that was maybe not quite. Yeah, it's not bad. That's around about that, 2015 through to about 2022, right? That was the case. Interest rates are incredibly low. Inflation is incredibly low. Corbynism could be a program of not talking that much really about taxing the rich. It didn't. There was no wealth tax that I recall. It wasn't part of the discussion. But it could be, we're going to borrow a load of money and invest across the country and rebuild the economy, which is what markets were telling you should be doing, because that's what it means when you have really low interest rates. It's people desperate to lend you money. What's happened since the pandemic, with the various shocks we've had since then, with inflation creeping up, interest rates are now much higher than they will be. Inflation is much higher than it was. These things aren't going to change. So when you start talking about borrowing, and when you start talking about how the government can add to its debt, it has more consequence. That is a true fact in the world that we now are part of. And for a country like Britain, which is very much exposed to what happens in the rest of the world, we import half the gas that we burn here for our heating and our electricity. We rely on at least 30% of our food is purely imported, and we have to import an awful lot of fertilizer to grow the food we do grow here. We're really exposed to what happens in the rest of the world. We're really exposed to whether or not we can borrow money from the rest of the world to pay for some of this stuff. Like, that's the economy we live in. It's kind of weak and shaky. So some of the arguments that are starting to play out is when you move from standing on the sidelines, which sadly I think the Greens and the left for a long period of time had done, and you can comment on things and say, wouldn't it be nice if, to being at a point where, what would it be like if you had to run the government? What does a credible, plausible, implementable, radical plan for government actually look like? And that's when these questions become serious, and you can't just go, it sort of doesn't matter. It sort of doesn't matter if you're borrowing. It kind of does matter, right? Because you have to deal with the economy we're in, not the one we want to get to, but we need a path to get there. And that's going to have to deal with, what are you going to do about the bond markets? What are you going to do about the Bank of England? What are you going to do about the Treasury? These big institutional questions are the ones we're up against. So I view this sort of tension that's appearing as a function of the Greens' success, and the fact that we're now in a world where it is plausible. It's plausible that the Greens could be in the next government that we have in this country.
In a week where the budget has dominated the news, it's on the issue of justice where this Labour government may prove most radical. That's because on Tuesday, the government announced they would be scrapping jury trials for all but the most serious cases in England and Wales. And the changes are being billed by ministers as a solution to tackling the enormous backlog of court cases, with more than 78,000 cases currently waiting to be heard, some of them for many years. So some trial dates now are 4 years in advance. So that is a genuinely real problem. We can't ignore that. These proposals, though, do seem to go against 800 years of precedent. Right? The idea that you are tried by your peers goes quite far back in British history. The briefing from the government, which they are understood to be officially announcing next week, follows on from recommendations given by former Judge Brian Levson. So it doesn't come out of nowhere. In July this year, Sir Brian Levson suggested the introduction of intermediate courts. They would have a judge and 2 magistrates or lay people, and they would only oversee cases where prison of up to 3 years was a potential punishment. Labour, though, are now suggesting that only 1 judge would be needed to decide on the guilt of a defendant, and it would be for defendants facing up to 5 years in prison. So that's serious. I mean, 3 years is serious. 5 years is much more serious. And the only exception seems to be pretty much murder, manslaughter, or rape. So anything else you're tried for, it could be just you and the judge. Presumably other people are in the room, but it's the judge who decides your fate. The plans have provoked widespread protest. Richard Atkinson is a former president of the Law Society.
I think it's an incredibly poor reaction to what I accept is a very serious problem, to change a fundamental principle of English justice, that lay people have an important part to play in the application of the criminal law and the determination of whether someone is guilty or not, which could have serious consequences for either the defendant or the principal complainant, is a departure that I don't believe is justified by the present circumstances.
Former Judge Wendy Joseph KC also explained her concerns.
Crown Court judges, those who sit on jury trials, at the moment never make findings of fact in the sense of guilt or innocence. There may be very, very rare and esoteric situations where they have to, but by and large, it's always been the province of your listeners, of all of us, of the jury, to make that really important decision, guilty or not. So judges have no training in how to find facts. And There is one mind working if you've only got one judge sitting on the case. At the moment, we have a system where 12 people from 12 different lives with 12 different sets of experiences pool those experiences and work together to try and find the true verdict. It will not be the same if one person does it, and a lot of judges will feel very uncomfortable about it.
The Criminal Bar Association has also released a pretty strong statement on the proposed changes. So they said, jury trial in place for hundreds of serious offences is a right which has been applauded and emulated by other nations. It is woven into the fabric of British society and is something of which the public has rightly been proud. Juries are trusted by ordinary working people, the very people this government repeatedly and pointedly professes to care for, to represent and to keep safe from harm. Juries are made up of ordinary human beings from all walks of life, of all ages, sex and ethnic background. Those are, I think, everyone will agree, very strong arguments. The government would argue in response, though, that if these are desperate measures, it's only because they find themselves in very desperate times. Sarah Sackman is the courts minister who spoke to The Guardian about why the government was considering reforms such as these. So she said, behind these 80,000 odd cases that are waiting in the backlog, there are individual stories and individual lives being put on hold behind each and every one of those cases. I've spoken to victims and survivors who tell me they've lost their jobs, they've suffered mental breakdowns all the while that they were waiting. More victims and witnesses are pulling out of the process because they cannot wait that long. That is compelling illustration of justice delayed being justice denied. Do we think that someone who has stolen a bottle of whiskey from a mini-mart should receive the right to trial by jury? Do we think that someone who has been involved in a serious fraud involving cryptocurrency, that we should have a jury sat in court for a year or more hearing such a case? For me, the priority is swift justice, fair justice, over prioritising a defendant's right to choose where that trial is heard. By the time that trial comes to court, everyone's memories are a little bit more fuzzy. If you're years away from when it took place, can you really get justice at all? That's not fair. Claimants dropping out of trials before they go to court is a huge problem alongside the backlog itself. So The Guardian reported earlier this year the number of rape victims pulling out of prosecutions before trial has more than doubled in 5 years, reaching nearly 8% of cases last year. So you can imagine if you're in a case, you've been subject to a horrific crime and then you have to wait 4 years for justice and you have to have that hanging over your head for 4 years. Also, if you've been wrongly accused of something and you have to have that hanging over your head for 4 years, that is terrible. That is a really, really, really bad problem that does need a proper solution. But this is a very extreme response. And it does put the Justice Secretary in particular in a difficult position. So in his 2017 review into racial bias in the criminal justice system, David Lammy praised juries, saying this. Juries deliberate as a group through open discussion. This both deters and exposes prejudice or unintended bias. Judgments must be justified to others. Successive studies have shown that juries deliver equitable results, regardless of the ethnic makeup of the jury or the defendant in question. Lammy also said something about juries in 2020, and this was after juryless trials were first discussed. So he said this, jury trials are a fundamental part of our democratic settlement. Criminal trials without juries are a bad idea. The government need to pull their finger out and acquire empty public buildings across the country to make sure these can happen in a way that is safe. Obviously, 2020, we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic, which is, one of the reasons why the courts are on their knees is because of austerity. Another one, a very big one actually, is that they couldn't really operate during COVID-19, which meant that you built up this enormous backlog. It always gets harder to clear a backlog when it's got very large. Apparently, this is because also less people are pleading guilty because they see, if I've got to wait 4 years, maybe I might get off. So that's one of the reasons why the backlog is creating a bigger backlog, if you see what I mean. Kemi Badenoch was quick to jump on the apparent change of heart from the Justice Secretary. So she said this, juries are not just part of our tradition, they put ordinary men and women of every walk of life at the heart of justice. Labour wants to shred this basic right, replacing the common sense of the jury box with rule by lawyers. It is a short-term decision that risks fairness, undermines public trust and erodes the very foundation of our justice system. David Lammy used to agree. So what's changed? She says Conservatives believe in our traditions and we believe in trial by jury. Sian Berry also put out a statement from the Green Party. So she said this. This is yet another assault on our rights from an increasingly authoritarian government. This proposal would scrap a fundamental cornerstone of our justice system, which has been in place for 800 years. For David Lammy to describe the right to trial by jury as not a right is a disgrace. The government must fund our justice system properly, not make people pay for Labour and Conservative austerity with their fundamental rights. The Green Party will fight these proposals all the way. I have seen some people sort of online comment this is akin to fascism. I mean, it's actually akin to France. So France has this system. So sort of, if this comes into place, it's not like, oh, democracy is over. But I still do think this is very bad, as we're actually going to see when we talk about our next story, which is how the judges have been switched in the case against Palestine Action. So obviously, if you have judges who all have different opinions, by the way, and then you can have them sort of shifted around based on the case, I'm not sure I wouldn't want one individual to decide whether I was going to prison for 5 years or to decide whether someone who had committed a crime against me was guilty. James, this is big, isn't it? This strikes me as a really big deal.
It is a really big deal. I mean, it seems to be a big deal done for not brilliant reasons. So the stuff about there are 800 years of precedent here, it kind of matters. I don't want to get too starry-eyed about our noble traditions of, common law and various rights that we enjoy in this country, but they do actually matter. Like, one of your barriers to not being able to have an authoritarian government do whatever it wants in this country are things like the right to trial by jury. It matters that you have this element of uncertainty and popular participation that's introduced into the system. An entirely sort of judge-led system is not something we have here. And yeah, they do have it in France. I mean, this is the continental system. We have an interrogative judge. One of the people you clipped was talking about this. But we don't have a system here set up to make that work and make that work in a way that would be fair and considered and reasonable. And P.S., we haven't had a revolution that would establish that sort of system, rather than the government sort of scrabbling around and saying, oh dear, there's a bit of a sort of backlog problem. Let's just trash 800 years worth of acquired rights and try and get through it that way. The austerity thing is a major part of this. Like, of the departments that have been cut under austerity since 2010, Justice Department is one of the ones that has been absolutely hammered. It's been hammered by successive Conservative-led governments in particular, because it looks like a bit of a free hit. I mean, if you just winkle away at legal aid, if you whittle away at the fact that you're not going to have enough judges being trained and can't run enough courts and all the rest of it, it looks like a bit of a free hit for a while until eventually it turns into a massive backlog. And as you correctly say, COVID simply added to this. This is a solid case for saying you need to put some money into something to make this work. You don't try and do what seems to be a cheap solution with these awful consequences, and they are awful consequences if you were to introduce this on something of a whim or as a sort of desperate sort of measure because you can't put the money there, rather than saying, okay, this is a serious considered proper proposal to try and reform the system, which even then, by the way, I'd probably oppose. I mean, it strikes me that the right to trial by jury is so fundamental to the kind of rights that we enjoy in this country and other places that have similar sort of common law derived systems, that you can't just get rid of that and you need to defend it. And it's good to see so many people running around to say this is an absolutely stupid, awful idea from the government.
It just does seem like a really strange example of a short-term problem and a serious, as we keep saying, it's a really serious short-term problem. Like, real harms are being done here, and I think probably there isn't a particular simple solution. I think that I think the government face a real challenge here. I wouldn't want to be in that position. It seems hard. I haven't sort of seen anyone saying it's really easy to fix this. Like, it sounds like it's difficult to fix this, but this is a short-term acute problem, and they seem to be making or proposing a change which has sort of centuries-long significance. And I find it weird that it's on this issue, because there are issues where there are secular crises, like an aging population does potentially mean that some sort of types of policy we've been used to won't work anymore. And, about how we fund pensions, how we fund the NHS, there's all sorts of these things where sort of like there is a trajectory of society which does mean we need to radically rethink things. There's an argument that sort of the fact that so many people can move these days in smartphones means that a similar thing applies to migration. I think that there are sort of secular changes in society that mean that radical policies might be warranted. But there are more people committing crimes. If anything, there's less people committing crimes. And pensioners are perfectly capable of serving on juries. So this just doesn't seem like we have a long-term policy that needs a radical fix. It seems like a long-term problem, that needs a radical fix. It seems like we've got this very short-term acute problem that should probably have a short-term acute fix, not something which completely changes the relationship between the citizen and the state. I find it completely bizarre. Let's go on to our next story, which, if you had any doubts about problems with judge-led justice, might push you into finding this as worrying as we do. Today, the High Court began hearing a judicial review of the government's decision to prescribe domestic direct action group, Palestine Action, as a terror organisation. Brought by Palestine Action co-founder Huda Amori, the review could decide that the then Home Secretary Yvette Cooper's ban was never legal, which would quash the whole thing. Really, really critical case, both for those who've been arrested for opposing the ban and for the government's overall legitimacy. If it was found to be unlawful that they did this sort of huge controversial decision, that would be a really big deal, and potentially a big deal for Israel as well, which means this development, frankly, stinks. On Monday, it was revealed in The Guardian that the judge who was supposed to preside over the case had been dramatically and at the last minute removed. Justice Chamberlain was the judge who granted the appeal, and he had said that he would preside over the hearing. But at the last minute, he's been replaced. And as The Guardian made clear, this was unusual, though not unprecedented. And the reason why it's not unprecedented is interesting. So let's read this. They say, it is unusual for a judge to be replaced, as Chamberlain was last Wednesday, so close to the hearing date, although it has happened to him earlier this year in the legal challenge to the UK's sale of F-35 aircraft parts to Israel, which he had also granted permission for. Asked why he'd been taken off the Palestine Action case, the Ministry of Justice referred the Guardian to the Judiciary Press Office, which refused to comment. So it's one of those things. It's very unusual, although it has been done before. Although when it was done before, it was also about Israel. Interesting. This is the second time this same judge has been removed from a case concerning Israel, as you saw in that bit of text I just read to you there. And what's even more suspicious is who he's been replaced by. So Novara Media has reported on the panel of 3 justices who have been brought in to replace Justice Chamberlain, so a single judge being replaced by a panel. My colleague Harriet Williamson writes this. The judge due to rule on whether the prescription of Palestine Action is lawful has been swapped last minute for a panel that includes a judge with a long history of working for the government and another who ruled in favour of the UK selling parts for fighter jets to Israel, leading to accusations of a stitch-up. The original judge, billed to preside over the High Court judicial review, Sir Martin Chamberlain, has been pulled at short notice and replaced with a 3-person panel of judges, Dame Victoria Sharp, Dame Karen Stein, and Sir Jonathan Swift. Now, we can go through sort of brief profiles of all these 3 judges who are on this new panel. So on Jonathan Swift, Harriet writes this. Swift is perhaps best known for rejecting WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's appeal against extradition to the US in June 2023, ruling in favour of then Home Secretary Priti Patel. Swift has a long history of working for the British state. He was the government's top lawyer, a position called First Treasury Counsel, from 2006 to 2014, in which he advised and represented the government in major litigation, representing the Defence and Home Secretaries in at least 9 cases. He also acted for the Cabinet Office, Treasury and Justice Secretary during this period and represented the Foreign Office in at least 2 cases in 2011 and 2015. That's according to an investigation by Declassified. The government paid him nearly £1 million to represent it from 2010 to 2013. More controversially, in June 2022, Swift ruled in favour of the government over the controversial Rwanda plan, saying that deportation flights of asylum seekers should be allowed to proceed. He said the risk posed to refugees was in the realms of speculation. It doesn't necessarily sound particularly neutral. You wonder why he might have been replaced by the guy who had sort of granted the appeal. So what about the others? Well, this is what we know about Dame Karen Stein. So Dame Karen Stein ruled that the government's decision to allow the export of F-35 fighter jets components to Israel during the genocide in Gaza was lawful. This ruling came despite the government itself accepting that the F-35 parts could be used to commit or facilitate violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza. Stein replaced Chamberlain as the judge in this case, and they rejected the challenge brought by West Bank-based NGO Al-Haq, finding that the UK's participation in the F-35 programme is a matter for the electorate and not the court. So again, so I said this is unusual, but it has happened before. So Justice Chamberlain was replaced by Karen Stein in a previous case, and that was the case about whether or not it was illegal to export F-35s, and then Karen Stein decided it was perfectly legal. Okay, so what about the third judge? Maybe they will seem more neutral. In this case, maybe that will restore some confidence in our justice system. The new panel's head judge is Dame Victoria Sharp, president of the King's Bench Division of the High Court of Justice since 2019 and the most senior judge in the administrative court, so at least they're senior. While there's no suggestion of influence on Dame Sharp, it is the case that her twin brother is Richard Sharp, a former JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs banker, and 2 banks with investments in Israeli arms manufacturer Elbit Systems, and a multimillionaire Tory donor who is considered by those who know him broadly pro-Israel. That's according to a 2021 BBC report. So Richard Sharp, as you might remember, was appointed chair of the BBC in 2021 by Boris Johnson, but had to resign after it emerged he'd previously helped Johnson secure a loan. So we should say those first 2, that was information about them. The third person, Victoria Sharp, that was information about her brother. But still, you can take that information in whatever way you so choose. I'm joined now by my colleague Stephen Methven, who was at the first day of that hearing at the High Court today. Stephen, this looks like a stitch-up, is it?
I mean, it does, doesn't it, Michael? It's not looking good. But look, I'm going to contextualize it a little bit. I'm not saying it isn't, but I'm going to give you the arguments for and against. But then I want to contextualize it in the wider scene, if you'll give me a minute, which I think will show that it's part of a stitch, you might say, in what I think is a larger stitch-up when it comes to this case. So the people who say, no, this is perfectly reasonable, will say things like, well, look, Victoria Sharp is the most senior judge in the King's Bench, which is King's Bench Division, which is the division under which the administrative court falls. So in a case of this importance, it might seem normal to put her in charge, given that Chamberlain, for example, might have consulted with her anyway over questions of laws, given her seniority. Or that, for example, Chamberlain may have had a scheduling conflict, which, we can't know about. I mean, I actually looked at the listings in the court today, and Chamberlain did appear to be hearing another case. So I don't think that applies, unless there's some error in the listings. So those are the arguments that say, no, it's not a stitch-up. But what about the arguments that say yes? Well, there's all the reasons that you gave already. Karen Stain replaced Chamberlain once before, ruled in favour of the government about F-35 exports. Swift, former government lawyer, ruled with the government in many, many cases involving human rights. And Victoria Sharp has this connection to somebody, her twin brother, who is a Tory donor who was, appointed by Boris Johnson to chair of the BBC, and so on and so forth. Look, that one, I don't want to be held responsible for what my sibling does. I'm sure you don't want to be held responsible for what your sibling does. But there is that background. I mean, what they all have in common is being incredibly establishment figures. Stain is the daughter of a High Court judge. Sharp is the daughter of the former principal for the Ministry of Power, which is an old government department. So there is a kind of establishment sort of thing there. There's also something about Chamberlain, which people may not know, which is that in 2019, before he was a judge, he was appointed to represent the campaign against the arms trade in a case about the legality of Britain's exports of arms to Saudi Arabia to be used in Yemen, in that war there. And established that it was in fact illegal for the government to have done that. So he has expertise in this field of arms exports, as well as questions of the legality of government actions. So there's something about him that also, his removal, also bearing in mind, he's the person who has heard every single stage of this case, except for the appeals, but he's granted the right to appeal. He's also the person who, in an unprecedented move, allowed a judicial review of a prescription of a prescribed group. That has never happened before. So there are sort of features of Chamberlain that you might think make him look unsafe as a judge if the state is worried about being overruled, and features of the other three that make them look like a safer bet in the same case that the state is afraid of being overruled. But that's all in a way sort of speculative. And I mean, the issue here is really the lack of transparency, that nobody is explaining why this change happened, that the Ministry of Justice hasn't said anything, and that the scheduling department, whatever it was, has said they won't comment. Really justice is supposed to be in some sense transparent in order for people to have faith in it. And I think that some transparency here would be, invaluable. But let me put it into a wider context. So there are three other elements that I'd like to kind of join together here, three other stitches in what, the audience might conclude does amount to a stitch-up. One is that people may not know this, but what will happen over the next few days in this judicial review is this thing called the closed materials procedure. So at some point, government lawyers will present evidence to the judges, and the entire court will have to be cleared, including the applicant, Huda Amori, and her legal team. And instead, there will be a security-cleared barrister who will be allowed to stay to represent not Huda Amori, but her interests. And that evidence that will be disclosed is evidence that will never be disclosed to Amori or her legal team. The barrister won't be allowed to disclose whatever he or she hears in the closed session. And so there'll be no opportunity to rebut it or to address it by the team. It just sort of goes to the judges from the government's lawyers. And, a lot of people would say, look, this is an outrageous... I should say as well that this procedure can be triggered by a Secretary of State. We don't know whether that has been in this case, but it can be. And when the government a few months ago appealed Chamberlain's decision to give a judicial review to Palestine Action, there was closed evidence there as well. And the judges in that appeal actually came in the middle of the appeal hearing, and they said, we cannot understand why this is in closed evidence. We cannot understand why this is not in open evidence. So it looks like there was a closed procedure being used for material that was to be presented to the court, that even the judges themselves can understand why that was in place. So that's one element. Another element, and I want to be quite careful about talking about this one, is many of our audience will have seen that yesterday the police released video footage of an action at an Elbit factory allegedly carried out by Palestine Action. That is the subject of an ongoing trial at the moment. So we can't comment on that. We shouldn't comment on that. But what hasn't been said is that the evidence that the police has released is the prosecution's evidence. And I've seen a lot of accounts online and rather large figures drawing conclusions publicly from that evidence while a case is ongoing. Now, you might think, it's not unusual in a criminal case for evidence to be released, prosecution evidence to be released to the public once it's been displayed in court, because then the jury has seen it. But in this case, where it's happening concurrently with a very, very important civil liberties trial, a very, very important trial, a hearing rather, about the power of the government, the legality of its actions involving the same organization, it seemed to me potentially, there would be positive effects for the government in that material coming out at the time that it did, and people drawing the conclusions that they shouldn't draw, but they have drawn online. And then the last thing I'll say connects us back to this juries issue that you talked about before. Juries have become an increasing headache for judges involved in past cases involving direct action of various kinds. Like I'm going to talk about the climate, for example, where juries have acquitted people on the basis that they've defended themselves, or they've argued that they did that action out of conscience to prevent a bigger crime or disaster. And judges don't like that and haven't liked that because it's meant that they've acquitted not on facts, but on other matters. And there's been an increasing habit by judges to stop, during those climate trials, increasingly it was the case that judges were ruling out of defendants being allowed to make those defenses. So you have this idea that actually at the same time as all of this is happening, the question of jury trials is coming into... The question of jury trials being allowed to continue is coming into question by the very same government who has made this application to, or made this decision to ban as a terrorist group, a direct action group. And, juries are also very important for another reason, which is to do with what I said at the top. Whatever you want to say about these judges, they're all very establishment figures. Juries are not. Juries are your peers. So, establishment figures don't live the lives that you and I live, Michael, and they don't live the lives that people in the dock live, and they don't live the lives they don't have the interests that people in the dock have. So these are all sorts of elements around like the relationship between the government and the judiciary, which is supposed to be separate, which are fraying, breaking down, being interfered with by the government, you might think, in ways that make it all look like a bit of a stitch-up.
This whole situation really makes me not want to be... I'm not planning on committing any crime that has a sentence of more than 5 years, but if I were to, or if I were to get accused of one, wrongly, I wouldn't, I think the idea of facing one of these judges who can get sort of switched out at the last minute and it's all, not very open, sounds a bit terrifying. Stephen, before I let you go, you were at court today. What can you tell us about what happened? I understand there were sort of more people holding up the I Support Palestine Action posters and getting carried away.
Yeah, that's right, Michael. I was actually in court in the overspill room at the beginning of the day to hear just the start of the case, because today was the first day of the judicial review. Very busy courtroom, so an overspill room was put on. I went there to see whether anything would be said about the switch out of the judges, and nothing was said in the courtroom. I don't know whether things were said in chambers or whatever, but nothing was said in the courtroom today. And then, yes, I was there to report again, I think maybe for my sixth or seventh time or something, on Defend Our Jury's protest involving about 200 people who decided to break the law, the counter-terror law, by holding up their terrorist signs that say, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action. A lot of them wanted to talk about the change in the judges today. A lot of a kind of, for them, a degradation of their confidence in justice being done at the Royal Courts of Justice. And of course, it really matters to them because many of them, it's not their first time doing this. Many of them have been arrested under Terror Act. Over 2,200 people around the country have so far been arrested. There'll be more protests over the weekend. Around 255 people, I think, have been charged under the Terror Act with offences related to these actions. The ruling, the judicial review, how it goes really matters because, if it's found that Yvette Cooper did act illegally or against her own procedures, there are 4 grounds on which Huda Mori is arguing, then all of those arrests become unlawful arrests. All of those arrests are cancelled. All of those charges are cancelled. If it doesn't get overturned, then the wheels of justice will continue to turn. And, what we're hearing now is that the way that many of these cases will be tried, because there are so many of them, we already have an overwhelmed judicial system. Now we've suddenly got 2,250 or whatever it is, pensioners, largely, upstanding, retired people, vicars, facing justice in an overcrowded judicial system. And so what we've been hearing is that the way that it's going to be dealt with is that there will be 30-minute trials, or they'll be tried in groups of 5 and allocated roughly, or maybe even less than 30 minutes each to make the defense. Now that really seems to me to be absurd. We're talking about an extremely severe charge here, a charge under the Terrorism Act. Travel restrictions follow from that. All kinds of things get closed off to you. You may not go to prison if you're charged under Section 13, but you may. If you're charged under Section 12, you could go to prison for 14 years. This is crazy times where justice for such a, as I say, severe, heavy charge is 30 minutes in front of a judge. That made them all, that was one of the things we talked about. That made many of those protesting sort of quite depressed. But the other thing was that actually, when I said, well, if it goes the wrong way for you at the judicial review, what will you do? And they all just said, many of them just said, well, I'm going to keep doing this until they put me in jail.
I can definitely imagine sort of in 5 years' time, I was saying, well, they got 30 minutes. That's amazing. Well, I only got 5 minutes in front of my judge. Let's wrap up there. Thank you so much to my guests, James Meadway and Stephen Methven. Thank you all for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.